Thank goodness.
I heard that.
Twiggy, are you still upset because you're not going to visit Genesia with us?
Captain Buck Rogers, you are now in the 25th century.
Imagine a frozen astronaut drifting through space, about to wake up in a world he never imagined. That's how we first meet Captain William Buck Rogers, and honestly, it's one of the coolest openings in TV history. Back in 1979, when Buck Rogers in the 25th century hit our screens, sci-fi was having a moment. Star Wars had blown everyone's minds 2 years earlier, and suddenly space was the hottest thing on TV. But here's what made Buck Rogers special. It wasn't trying to be Star Wars. Instead, it took this character from the 1920s, comic strips and radio shows, and completely reinvented him for the disco era. Think about that. A World War I era hero, wrapped in 70s sparkle, beamed into our living rooms every week. It was wild, and somehow it worked. The show actually started as a theatrical movie, which is pretty unusual. Universal Studios threw some serious money at it. About $3.5 million, which was a decent budget for TV back then. When it hit theaters in March 1979, people showed up. The movie made enough cash to convince NBC to turn it into a weekly series, and that's when things got really interesting. You've got to remember what TV was like back then. Most shows were either cop dramas, sitcoms, or variety shows. But here comes Buck Rogers with its shiny spaceships, robot sidekicks, and a hero who was basically a man out of time. It was like nothing else on prime time. The show wasn't just about space battles and laser guns, though there were plenty of those. It was about this guy from our time trying to make sense of a future where Earth had survived a nuclear war, rebuilt itself, and was now dealing with space pirates, alien princesses, and artificial intelligence. What really grabbed people wasn't just the sci-fi stuff. It was how the show managed to mix action, humor, and some pretty clever social commentary. Buck wasn't just fighting bad guys. He was showing this advanced civilization that sometimes the old ways of thinking could still be useful. And in a time when America was dealing with massive social changes, that message hit home. The whole thing could have been cheesy, and sometimes it was. But there was something genuinely captivating about watching this 20th century pilot navigate a world of computer councils, space fighters, and a future where Earth had finally gotten its act together, even if it took a nuclear war to do it. And you know what's kind of amazing? While other shows from that era feel completely dated now, a lot of what Buck Rogers was playing with, artificial intelligence, environmental concerns, the clash between human intuition and computer logic, that stuff is more relevant than ever. It's like the show accidentally predicted some of our biggest conversations today, just with more disco outfits and ray guns. That's what made Buck Rogers in the 25th century more than just another Star Wars cash-in. It took an old character, gave him new life, and somehow created something that was both very 1979 and weirdly timeless. And if you think about it, that's pretty much what Buck himself was doing in the show, taking the best of the past and using it to help build a better future. When you dive into the technical side of Buck Rogers, you start to realize just how ambitious this show really was. Universal Studios went all out with their miniature work, and we're not talking about tiny models thrown together in a hurry. These were seriously detailed spaceships and space stations that had to look good enough for both television and theatrical release. Remember those Earth Defense Directorate ships? They created this whole fleet of miniatures that could split into different sections on camera. The special effects team, working with what they had in the late 70s, pulled off some pretty impressive stuff. They'd shoot these models against black velvet. Old school, but it worked. And the way they lit those ships, with all these tiny fiber optic lights inside, that was cutting edge for TV back then. But here's where it gets interesting. They were basically pioneering TV green screen work before we even called it green screen. They used this blue screen process to composite the actors into space scenes, which was pretty risky for weekly television. Sometimes it looked a bit rough around the edges, but when it worked, it was magic. You'd see Buck's fighters zooming through space, and even though we know better now, back then it felt real. The art direction is what really sets Buck Rogers apart, though. Just look at those costumes. They're like disco meets space age in the best possible way. Those metallic jumpsuits and Colonel Deering's uniforms weren't just random designs. They were trying to create this whole visual language for what the 25th century might look like. And yeah, maybe some of it looks a bit silly now, but there's this incredible retro-futuristic vibe that actually holds up. Here's something a lot of people don't know. To save money, the show shared resources with Battlestar Galactica. They'd reuse sets, props, even some footage. But instead of looking cheap, they managed to make it work by establishing this consistent future aesthetic. The hallways of the Earth Defense Directorate, the computer consoles, even the weapons, everything had this cohesive design that made the world feel lived in and real. The show faced this constant challenge. How do you create a convincing future world on a TV budget? Some episodes had to be more earthbound than others, but when they did go all out on the effects, it was spectacular. Those space battles with the Tiger ships, the shots of New Chicago's skyline, even the practical effects for Tweaky the robot, all of this stuff had to be done practically, in camera, week after week. One of the coolest technical achievements was how they handled the Stargate effects. Instead of just doing a basic light show, they created these elaborate sequences using multiple passes with the camera, building up layers of effects. For 1979 television, this was pretty groundbreaking stuff. They were pushing the boundaries of what you could do on a TV schedule and budget. The production design team deserves serious credit too. They had to create everything from alien marketplaces to advanced computer rooms, and they did it with this perfect mix of practical and futuristic elements. The way they used lighting, especially in those indoor scenes, helped hide the budget limitations while creating this distinct look that really said, this is the future, but one that evolved from our world. All these technical elements came together to create something that, while maybe not as polished as modern sci-fi, had its own unique charm and style. They were making it up as they went along sometimes, but that's what made it special. This was television trying to do something new, pushing the limits of what was possible in weekly sci-fi programming. You know what really made Buck Rogers work? The cast. Let's start with Gil Gerard as Buck. He could have played Buck as this stiff, heroic type, but instead, he brought this great mix of charm and confusion to the role. Here's this guy who wakes up 500 years in the future. And instead of being totally freaked out, he's kind of rolling with it, making jokes, flirting with space princesses. Gerard made Buck feel like a real person, someone who used humor to deal with being completely out of his element. Then there's Erin Gray as Colonel Wilma Deering. She was way ahead of her time. In 1979, having a female military leader who could fight, fly spacecraft, and command respect wasn't exactly common on TV. Gray brought this perfect balance to Wilma. She was tough when she needed to be, but you could see these moments where Buck's 20th century perspective made her question things about her own world. The chemistry between her and Gerard was fantastic. You could feel the tension between Buck's laid-back attitude and Wilma's by-the-book approach. Here's something a lot of people forget. Mel Blanc, the voice of Bugs Bunny, was the voice of Tweaky. That little robot could have been super annoying, but Blanc gave him this personality that made him more than just a walking catchphrase machine. When Tweaky would say "bitty bitty bitty" before his lines, it somehow never got old, and that's all down to Blanc's delivery. One of my favorite episodes is when Buck and Wilma have to go undercover in this space casino. You've got Gerard playing this super confident gambler, Gray getting to show off Wilma's more playful side, and this great tension because they're surrounded by danger but have to act casual. It's like Ocean's 11 in space, and it shows off everything that made the show work. The chemistry between the leads, the fun sci-fi concepts, and that ability to mix action with humor. Tim O'Connor deserves a shout out too. As Dr. Hewer, he had the tough job of explaining all this future stuff to Buck and the audience without sounding like he was reading from a textbook. He he brought this wonderful grandfatherly quality to the role, and when he and Buck would disagree about how to handle a crisis, you could believe both their perspectives. The casting almost went very differently too. Originally, they wanted a completely different actor for Buck, but Gerard won the role because he brought this natural, relatable quality to the character. It's hard to imagine anyone else pulling it off the same way. And get this, Erin Gray almost didn't take the role because she was worried about being typecast in sci-fi shows. Thank goodness she changed her mind. The character dynamics really sold the show's bigger themes. You had Buck representing old-school human intuition up against this super-organized, computer-dependent future society. Through these characters, especially in scenes between Buck and Wilma or Buck and Dr. Hewer, the show could explore some pretty deep ideas about progress, humanity, and whether newer always means better. Some of the most memorable scenes weren't even the big action sequences. They were these smaller moments where you'd see the characters trying to understand each other's perspectives. Like when Buck would make some 20th century reference that completely confused everyone. Or when Wilma would gradually start to see that maybe some of Earth's old values were worth holding on to. When Buck Rogers first hit theaters as a movie in 1979, people weren't quite sure what to make of it. Here was this show that looked like Star Wars, but felt more like a throwback to the sci-fi serials of the 1930s. But you know what? The audience showed up. The theatrical release did well enough that NBC got excited about turning it into a weekly series. The first season was this weird, wonderful mix of serious sci-fi and campy fun. Critics were split. Some loved how the show didn't take itself too seriously, while others thought it was too lightweight. But viewers? They tuned in week after week. Buck Rogers was competing with some heavy hitters in its time slot, but it held its own. Then season 2 happened, and everything changed. The producers decided to shake things up, big time. They scrapped the Earth Defense Directorate setting and sent Buck and Wilma off into deep space aboard the Searcher. It was like they were trying to turn it into Star Trek. Some of the changes were pretty dramatic. They ditched several regular characters and brought in new ones like Hawk, this Birdman warrior played by Tom Christopher. Here's a fascinating detail most people don't know. The show's original creator, Glenn A. Larson, was barely involved in season 2. He was busy with other projects, including Knight Rider, and the new production team had different ideas about where to take the series. This led to some behind-the-scenes tension that actually showed up on screen sometimes. The second season also tried to be more serious, which was kind of a mixed bag. Some episodes dealt with heavier themes like genocide and colonialism, particularly through Hawk's storyline about his nearly extinct people. But a lot of fans missed the lighter touch of season 1. The ratings started to slip, and you could feel the show struggling to find its new identity. One of the most controversial changes was reducing Erin Gray's role as Wilma Deering. In season 1, she was this strong, central character, but in season 2, she often got pushed to the background. Fans noticed, and they weren't happy about it. There were some hidden gems, though. The show did some really experimental episodes that people don't talk about enough. Like this one episode where they explored parallel universes. Pretty advanced stuff for 1981 television. And there was this great two-parter about a space plague that felt more like a thriller than a typical sci-fi show. But here's what's really interesting. Even though the show only ran for 2 seasons, both versions have their defenders. Some fans swear by season 1's more playful approach, while others prefer season 2's attempt at deeper storytelling. It's like the show accidentally created 2 different versions of what future sci-fi TV could be. The ratings battle eventually took its toll, and NBC pulled the plug in 1981. The thing is, by then, Buck Rogers had already left its mark. It had shown that you could do serious sci-fi concepts on TV while still having fun with them. And even though some episodes didn't age well, others feel surprisingly relevant today. Buck Rogers might have ended in 1981, but its influence is everywhere in modern sci-fi. Look at Farscape. It's basically Buck Rogers in reverse, with a modern astronaut lost in space. Even Marvel's Captain America follows that man-out-of-time concept that Buck helped pioneer on TV. The show was weirdly prophetic too. Those episodes about artificial intelligence making decisions for humans? That's today's AI ethics debate. Stories about Earth recovering from environmental disaster? Sounds like our current headlines. Even the show's balance of serious sci-fi with humor set the template for series like Stargate SG-1 and The Orville. Buck Rogers also changed how TV shows made money. Its massive toy line and merchandise helped create the model of sci-fi shows being more than just weekly episodes. They became worlds fans could collect and play in. What's really interesting is how the show's optimistic view feels relevant today. Sure, in Buck's timeline, Earth went through a nuclear war, but humans rebuilt, united, and reached for the stars. In our era of climate change and global tensions, there's something inspiring about that message. There have been several attempts to reboot Buck Rogers, with the latest announced in 2021. But maybe the original special mix of retro charm and forward-thinking sci-fi is hard to recreate. The show wasn't just about adapting to the future. It showed that some old-fashioned human qualities like intuition and empathy are timeless. So next time you're watching a sci-fi hero crack jokes while saving the galaxy, remember Buck Rogers. He might be from the 25th century, but he helped shape science fiction as we know it. Like what you heard? Hit subscribe for more deep dives into classic sci-fi that shaped our future. Tell me in the comments, what other retro sci-fi shows deserve a fresh look?